Alright, so in this video we continue. This is the last part of chapter 1. Now we look at the organization of the biosphere. So what is this biosphere? This is a zone of air, land, and water at the surface of the earth where living organisms are found. Actually, bios means living organisms, or bio means living organisms, and sphere is the place where they live. So a biosphere is the place where living organisms are found. So this is in short what it means. So a sphere where living organisms are found. So we have when we talk about the earth, we have atmosphere, we have hydrosphere, we have all these spheres, but a biosphere will be found in water. A biosphere will also be found on land, because even within water we have fish and other things there. On land we have insects, we have people, and we have so many groups of living organisms. Now, within the living organisms, we have populations. So, populations are groups of individual species in a given area. So, example, we can say we have a population of ants. So a population, you are talking about a single species. For example, population of ants. We cannot say the population of ants and millipedes, or the population of ants and grasshoppers, because those two are different species. You can say a population of grasshoppers as a single species, or a population of humans, that is a single species. So populations, you do not mix up. Within a certain living space, if you want to look for population, you just select one species that you are looking at and find out how many things are within, or how many people, how many ants are within that area. So you say this area has 1 million ants. That's the population of ants. Or this area has 40,000 people. That's the population of people. But you don't want to say this area has 40,000 people, 40,000 ants and people. No, you need to separate them. You say I have 40,000 people and I have 40,000 ants. Or I have 20,000 people, that is the population of people, and I have 20,000 ants. That is the population of ants. Now, when you combine different species, that is no longer population. That becomes a community. So you can say this is a community of ants, people, and birds. So community of ants, people, and birds. So what we are saying is, when you add the populations, if you have a single area and you have different populations from different animals or different species, when you add all those populations, they give you communities. So a community is population of different species that interact. So like communities or like ants can interact with people, people can interact with birds, birds can interact with cattle and the like. So when they interact within a certain place, they are in a single community. Now when we have a number of communities, when we have several communities that are interacting, we call that an ecosystem. So especially we have these communities that are interacting, and then we also include their habitat. If we go back to community, for community, you are just interested with the living things in there. So community and population, you are interested with the living things. Now when you talk about an ecosystem, you include the non-living things. For example, in our ecosystem here, we have different communities. We have people, we have animals, we have trees. All those living things are different communities. Or all those living things are different populations. We have populations of trees, population of ants, or we have a community of animals and a community of plants, and maybe a community of some other living thing, a community of bacteria or whatever. But when we talk about an ecosystem, we also include where they live. So in this ecosystem, we talk about interaction between these communities or the living things and the Snake River. So Snake River is a habitat, it's part of our ecosystem. And also maybe the grades, like Lewiston grade, the Palouse, and the like, all those are an ecosystem. Roads, mountains. So the interaction that we as living things do with our habitat, the whole system, including the living things and the habitat, are known as ecosystem. So the difference between these things I'm talking about, biosphere is just the sphere where these living things are found, while population deals with a single species, how many of the single species are there, while community deals with several species, how many of the several species are there. Ecosystem deals with, okay, these species, where do they live and how do they interact with their surrounding. So that is called ecosystem. Now when you talk about an ecosystem, ecosystem is characterized by so many things. If you have to live in an ecosystem, if you have to survive, the ecosystem must provide something for you to be able to survive. For example, the ecosystem provides us with oxygen. Without the ecosystem provide oxygen, we are not going to survive. The ecosystem provides the trees with carbon dioxide. So without that, the trees will not survive, and even people will not survive. That's what we mean when we say we are interacting with the ecosystem. So because of that, there are so many what we call cycles, energy flows, and the like. So we have what we call chemical cycling. One of them is carbon. Another one is hydrogen. So the carbon will provide carbon dioxide and then get carbon back. Hydrogen will provide water, that is hydrogen cycle. Oxygen also will provide carbon dioxide, oxygen, and bring back oxygen. Nitrogen cycle is important for fertilizers and the like. The same with phosphorus cycle, provides nutrients to the ecosystem, and as people we use that. So if someone asks you what does the ecosystem provide to humans, the first thing you say it provides chemical cycling, and you give the examples. We have carbon cycle, we have hydrogen cycle, we have oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. What else does an ecosystem provide? An ecosystem is characterized by energy flow. So the energy we use comes from sunlight. So the sunlight is the biggest source of energy. So I need to take note of that. So energy from the sunlight can go to the trees through photosynthesis, and when we eat things from the fruits of the trees, we have energy that we use to talk and to do all sorts of things. So there is what we call energy flow, but this flow starts from the sunlight, and then through photosynthesis it changes to chemical energy in plants, and when we eat we can use it to heat our bodies, we can use it to talk, we can use it to run, all sorts of things. So that should be provided by the ecosystem for the survival of the living things. So this is an example of an ecosystem. These ones are hard to see. You can see the sun here. The sun providing solar energy to the ecosystem. The energy goes to the plants, and the plants, they undergo photosynthesis, and they'll produce carbon dioxide, they'll produce different things, and this energy from this one will eat, this hair here will eat the plant, and the plant will eat, and the falcon here, or the eagle, is going to eat the hair, and sorts of things. The snake is going to eat the hair and transfer that energy. So there is just energy transfer. As this one is flapping its wings, it produces heat. So that is also another form of energy transfer within the ecosystem. But all this we see here, including this soil and the land, is the ecosystem. So an ecosystem is very important because humans would depend on healthy ecosystem. because of that, we need to take good care of the ecosystem for our own survival. Most of the time, the humans will modify the ecosystem. There are several ways we can modify ecosystem. Mining, buildings, and really like carbon emission from cars and the like, factories, etc. So that can affect the ecosystem. But if we keep on damaging the ecosystem, we are not going to survive. That's why it is important to take good care of the ecosystem so that we are able to survive. Nowadays, people talk about climate change. Climate change is being led by damage to the ecosystem. So we need to be careful. To our ecosystem. So I think that's about ecosystem. Now when we talk within the ecosystem, we have what we call biodiversity. Really, biodiversity just talks about having different species. Diverse means different or various or different. So biodiversity means the having different living species. So, or this one is messed up. Let me just. So biodiversity means having various, or in our case, in other cases, diverse species. So the study of the variability in a species. So we talk about as a simple definition of biodiversity, it is just the total number of species. So when you say total number of species, we mean different species. So for example, does the world have 30 million different species? How do these species vary in terms of their genes? So if you want to determine the differences in genetics, we use what we call genomics. Study of differences in genetics or genes among species. So as a definition, biodiversity is just total number of species, and it will include the variability in their genes, the variability or the differences in the genes among these species. Also, biodiversity includes the ecosystem in which these different species will live. So, and it is important to take note that as humans, as we already said, we affect the ecosystem, and we affect the ecosystem, and then the biodiversity decreases. For example, if you are constructing a hydroelectric dam, if you are doing that, first some land, for you to develop your dam, you need to claim some land, and that land had so many animals, had insects that live above water, had so many things that live on land. But when you build your hydroelectric dam, all those things will die because there will be water all over. In that case, as humans, you are affecting the ecosystem and the biodiversity on that land. Actually, some fish will also die as you are building your hydroelectric dam. So that's how humans will affect the biodiversity in the ecosystem. One thing that is really affected is the coral reef, where fish are normally found. Human activity can affect this coral reef, and as human activities affect this part, fish will not have food, will not have clean air, will not have so many things that they need to survive. And you will see that several species of fish will be lost because of the human activities to the coral reef. And take note of this number. The Earth usually loses as many as 400 species every day due to human activities. There is a lot of human activities that happen, and this is one question that can come on quiz. How many species does the Earth lose per day due to human activities? So the number is 400 species. All right. So that is all about diversity, biodiversity, ecosystem. But in biology is a science. So as a science, we have a systematic way on how to study it. And to do that, we use the process of science. So really, the process of science is just a systematic way of studying maybe a system to get to an appropriate conclusion. That's really what we do when we talk about the scientific method or the process of science. So it just means what really scientists do. That's all. So what is this process of science? Here the diagram shows you that as scientists we usually make observations. So for example, you are walking and there are two gardens, that is Mindaiwili, and in those two gardens, one garden has very, very good crop or good maize, very big, huge, and the other garden really has wilting maize. We say chonyala. And then you say, oh, what you have done there is an observation. So you are walking around, so say you see two maize gardens, one with good crop, another with bad crop. That is an observation. So what you do in study, you make an observation. Sometimes this observation comes from reading what other people have done. So I'll say sometimes this observation comes from reading what other people have done. We call that a literature review. So observation can come in different ways. But as scientists, normally we make observations, we go to previous studies and see what other people did. And then from there, we can say, all right, I have made an observation. If we come back to this example, where you see two maize gardens, one garden is good, has good crop, and the other garden has bad crop. That is your observation. Then, based on that observation, you make a hypothesis. So your hypothesis is, I see these are different gardens. But I'm just assuming that maybe this garden has fertilizer in it. Maybe this other garden has no fertilizer in it. Just by looking at the two gardens. And then you can say, you know what? If I add fertilizer to my garden, it will have more yield than if I do not add fertilizer to my garden. So that is your hypothesis. A statement that you make after making an observation. If I add fertilizer to my garden, it will have more yield than if I do not. You do not just make this statement. You make that statement after already knowing what fertilizers can do. That's why it's not just a guess. A hypothesis should have backing. So in that case, you make a statement after observing what happened before or after reading about something. So here we are saying a hypothesis is input from various sources, is used to formulate a testable statement. It should not just be a guess. So we need to read here. It is input from various sources, is used to formulate a testable statement. Don't just guess. You need to have background knowledge on what you are doing, on what statement you are making. So here my hypothesis is, if I add fertilizer to my garden, it will have more yield than if I do not. Now, after you develop your hypothesis, then you go on and do an experiment. So in terms of an experiment, you have 2 gardens. You add fertilizer to one garden. You leave the other garden without fertilizer. Or maybe you have 2 gardens. You add more fertilizer to one garden. You add very little fertilizer to the other garden. That is your experiment. You are conducting an activity that is there to determine if your hypothesis is correct or incorrect. After you do your experiment, then you make a conclusion. You have your data, you analyze the data. After the analysis, you can say, oh, now after I have done all the analysis, after I have looked at my data, I see that the garden with more fertilizer has more yields, has more crops than the garden without fertilizer, or than the garden with less fertilizer. So that is your conclusion. After you make conclusion, you do several experiments, several experiments. After you make your conclusion, then you can create a scientific theory. So in this scientific theory, you explain what the fertilizer is doing. Is doing to increase crops. So one explanation can be, you know what, fertilizer has nitrogen. So this nitrogen is good food for animals or for plants. So one explanation is fertilizer has nitrogen, which fixes the soil and therefore providing good crop. So that explanation is a theory. Now you are trying to explain what you get from many experiments. You do not develop a theory just by one experiment only. You need to have tons and tons of experiments for you to come up with a theory, a scientific theory. But really, a scientific theory is there to just explain why you got that result, to explain why you got a good yield. That's what a theory is doing. So by definition, a theory answers the question why. That's what question the theory will answer. So here we define a theory as a scientific theory is a concept supported by a broad range of observations, experiments, and conclusion. So this is the major definition of how to look at a theory. It is a well-substantiated explanation, so that is important, answers the question why. A well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world based on a body of facts that have been repeatedly confirmed through observations and experiments. That is very important definition of a theory. And we need to take note, these supported fact theories are not guesses. They are not guesses at all. They are reliable accounts of the real world, things that have been observed through experiments, through readings, through observations, through so many different things. That's how you develop a theory. You are not guessing. So in biology, theories that you need to know, I think these ones will come on your exam, so you just need to memorize them. We have a cell theory. So a cell theory, you look at life and say, why do people behave this way? Why do animals behave this way? In the end, you say, I believe that all life is made of cells. So that is a cell theory. So take note of this theory. When you are asked what is a cell theory, you just say, a cell theory says all life is cellular. And new life comes from previous cells. So a cell theory says all life is cellular, new life comes from previous cells. You need to complete the whole thing. Then we have homeostasis theory, which deals with the stable internal environment. So if someone asks you, give me the homeostasis theory, you just say it's a theory that deals with stable internal environment. Someone says, give me a gene theory. So when you say a gene theory, you just say it's a theory that deals with codes and units of heredity or DNA. What about ecosystem theory? That is, organisms within an environment are interrelated. These things, you need to memorize them. Then we have evolution theory, which says organisms genetically change and pass genes on to offsprings, and the best feed will survive. That's that's evolution theory. Now, we're still talking about these theories, and we are talking about scientific process as a continuation. Normally in science, we do what we call a controlled study. So by definition, a controlled study is an experiment that has two types of group. So you are in this experiment, you have a control group that is for comparison. So you do not intervene in this group. You do not do anything to them. Then you have experimental group where you add an intervention. Maybe you give them a new drug, e.g., give them a new drug. In a control group, you give them a placebo. What is a placebo? A placebo looks like a drug, but it's not actually a drug. Like if you are giving people an injection, you can give one group a new kind of penicillin and give another group just water. But they will think it is penicillin. Yet there is no penicillin in there. There is just water. It is the same as you have given them nothing. Normally, that's what we do with the control group. So for a controlled study, we have two groups. One, we have control group. Two, we have experimental group. The experimental group is the one that you give your intervention to. So as we are doing our experiments, we have what we call the experimental variable, or sometimes known as an independent variable. So what is this variable? It is the variable that we as investigators manipulate. And every other thing will not be manipulated except that variable. So, like you have, maybe you have two groups. You want to see if you want to give different types of medicine per week. The people get better and better and better and better. So let's suppose you have two groups and you want to give different types of medicine per week. And see if the people get better or report less sickness. Now, your experimental variable will be, or your independent variable, will be the different types of medicine. The reason is it is independent variable because it's the one that you as an experimenter are changing. So an independent variable is the one that you say, I want to increase this or I want to decrease this as an experimenter. It's the one that an experimenter changes. So it is the one that an experimenter directly changes. So that is an independent variable. But as we are saying, an experimental variable is manipulated by the investigator. We need to take note that all other factors remain identical. We don't manipulate them. But when you manipulate something, when you put independent variable or when you manipulate something, there is always a response to that manipulation. So that response to the manipulation is known as an independent variable or a response variable. So, for example, in the above case, we said if you change the medicine, for weeks and weeks, you are changing the medicine and the people will be coming reporting to you, I think I'm getting less sick. I think I'm getting less sick. Your independent variable was the medicine you are giving them. Now, when they tell you that I think I'm getting less sick because of that medicine, getting less sick is a response variable or a dependent variable, because getting less sick depends on the medicine. You as an experimenter, you did not come to them and say, let me just change you to not get sick. You did not do that. What you did, you give them medicine, which is an independent variable. And because of that medicine, they responded. They responded by getting less sick. Now, that getting less sick is dependent variable or response variable. So, a dependent variable is a response after being given an independent variable. So a response after being given an independent variable. So, for example, getting less sick. This is a dependent variable. After medicine, which is independent variable. So that's an independent variable is a result of a dependent variable is a result of an independent variable. So now this is an example. When we say a hypothesis, what do we mean? I already gave another example, but this is a different example. For example, you can say a pigeon pea wheat rotation will cause winter wheat production to increase, as well as or better than the use of nitrogen fertilizer. So that is your hypothesis after reading some other things. Normally, I will repeat that hypothesis. A sustained pigeon pea winter wheat rotation will eventually cause an increase in winter wheat production. That is your hypothesis. There is something that we have not discussed here, and that is a prediction. When you make your hypothesis, for you to do a study, you have to make a prediction first. So in this case, you say, you know what? Because the prediction is the one that you are actually studying. You are not studying the hypothesis. The prediction is the one that tells you do this, do this, do this, do this to fulfill your hypothesis. So in this case, I say, oh, my wheat biomass following 2 years of pigeon pea wheat rotation will surpass wheat biomass following nitrogen fertilizer treatment. When you make this prediction, this is what you are going to do. Now you are going to say, you know what? What I'm going to do first, I will have wheat biomass, and then I'll have 2 years of pigeon, and then wheat biomass again. I think this one is going to give me a good crop. So a prediction is like a plan of what you are going to do. But you make that plan and also having a result. If I do it this way, I'm going to get this result. That is a prediction. After prediction is when you go and do the actual experiment. So the actual planning of what you want to do depends on the predictions, because the predictions, they'll tell you, now use this amount, use this amount, use this amount, do this rotation, do this rotation. The hypothesis will not tell you that. It is just a general statement. So here we are just showing that when you do your experiment, you need to have a control here, this part, a control. This part is a test part, and you see good grass here, and here also we see good grass here, but now better grass when you use rotation than when you use ammonia or when you use nitrogen fertilizer. So that is your experiment there. And yeah, normally our experiment, we plot the graphs, data. It's important for experiment. That's something you need to do. And then you have your conclusion. What does your conclusion say? Is your hypothesis supported or it is not? So in this case, at the end of 2 years, we see that the yield of winter wheat followed by pigeon pea wheat rotation was better than for the other types. That is for the pod, which had no fertilizer, and the pod which had nitrogen fertilizer. And the one with crop rotation was really good. Also, when you deal with science, take note that there is need for social responsibility. Our technology is important, but also we need to make sure that to know that it has both benefits and drawbacks. I mean, DDT was used to prevent malaria, but it caused some other problems. So eugenics, where you manipulate things, like you are thinking like you are a god who can say this one lives, this one does not live. So those are things that you need to take note when doing scientific experiment. I think this is where the video ends.